The story begins with Ethan opening a message from former CIA deputy Erica, who is now serving as the President of the United States. In a VHS recording, Erica expresses her gratitude for Ethan's struggles over the past 35 years, but the President emphasizes that the world is currently heading towards the end times, where the entity is increasingly expanding its digital power across various parts of the world. The only way to stop the entity is by finding the entity's source code, which is believed to be known only by the entity's henchman, who is none other than Gabriel, whose whereabouts are currently unknown, even though Gabriel's subordinate named Paris is now heading to his detention but remains silent, unwilling to provide information, leaving America with no choice but to shift its focus to Ethan. They know that at this moment, Ethan holds the cross key related to the entity, and Ethan plans to eliminate the entity alone, which has the potential to completely erase the digital world. Then the President gave Ethan 3 options: to surrender and become a fugitive for life, or let the world meet its destruction, even though President Erica hopes Ethan will return home and hand over the cross key to the right hands. Ethan does not trust any party, therefore Ethan remains steadfast in his stance. At that moment, Ethan met Benji, who took him to another associate, none other than Luther, who was currently being treated in his secret private ward located within a tunnel. Without beating around the bush, Ethan revealed that he would search for Gabriel, and the only person who knows Gabriel's whereabouts is Paris, Gabriel's former henchman, who nearly died at the hands of his own master. At that time, Paris was being escorted by Desagas and 4 police officers, who were going to take him to the place where he would be detained. However, along the way, 2 police officers had a hidden plan. The 2 police officers incapacitated the other 2 officers, and Degas thought this was Paris's plan to escape. However, it turned out that when Degas and Paris were pointing their weapons at each other, Ethan and Benji revealed themselves, having been in disguise. Ethan tried to persuade Degas not to act rashly, asking him to be cooperative. Benji also reassured Paris that they are friends now. That's why both of them finally agreed to lower their weapons. Without beating around the bush, Ethan immediately asked Paris where Gabriel was located. Armed with information from Paris, he finally took Ethan to the American embassy located in London, England. Ethan entered the embassy office, but was recognized by the 2 guards there. Fortunately, Grace's presence helped Ethan escape from the 2 guards. Grace asked to join the mission, but Ethan asked Grace not to get involved because the mission was too dangerous. Grace then convinced Ethan that he was the only one she trusted, and the only person searching for the entity who wouldn't exploit it, because she believed Ethan was doing it to save the world. However, suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by another guard, who managed to capture both of them. Ethan was already tied up in a chair, while Grace was tied up standing in front of them. And Gabriel, whom they were looking for, was now standing in front of them. It turns out that Gabriel's failure in the previous Mission Impossible part led to him being ousted by the entity, and now Gabriel also wants to take control of the entity. Here, the location of the hidden entity source code is also revealed. Initially, the Americans created the program The Entity, an artificial intelligence believed to be able to hack anything. And at that time, America tested the entity on a highly advanced Russian submarine named Sevastopol, which was so advanced that it couldn't be detected by any country's radar. However, within just a few minutes, the entity was able to study the submarine system, and it didn't take long to incapacitate it. Feeling victorious, the Americans took pride in their success, but it was all a mistake, as it was just the beginning of a nightmare. It turns out that all this time, the entity was waiting for the right moment to gain its freedom, as if it had its own consciousness. The entity transferred a file containing the source code that was its lifeblood to a super server on the Sevastopol ship and sank it, which makes it so that no one can reach the ship. Thus, the source code that is the lifeblood of the entity remains untouched to this day. Therefore, it is clear that Gabriel's goal is to command Ethan to reach the ship, retrieve the source code, with Grace's life as collateral. However, Ethan had another plan. At that moment, he bit into a false tooth filled with poison that could kill him in seconds. Rather than obey Gabriel's orders, Ethan apparently preferred to end his own life. However, it was all just a manipulation by Ethan to escape. Failing to capture Ethan, Gabriel instead became their target, along with the presence of Benji and Paris. At that moment, Paris saw an object that felt familiar to her. Meanwhile, Gabriel, who was trying to escape and attempted to take a box, was denied access by the entity, and instead welcomed Ethan's arrival. In the box, there was some kind of mask, and Ethan was surprised to find out that the set of tools allowed Ethan to communicate with the entity. The entity manifests itself in a voice that speaks directly to Ethan as if it were a human, seemingly proving the genius of the entity visually. He showed Ethan various probabilities of different possibilities that would happen in the future, and even the entity could calculate Gabriel's movements, who is most likely to visit Luther. With all those possibilities, the entity presents Ethan with two very terrifying choices. If Ethan chooses to fight against the entity and take its source code, then his entire team will die and global destruction will occur. However, on the contrary, if Ethan does nothing, the world will be enslaved by the entity, and it will also be the end of the world. However, before Ethan made his choice, the entity provided a glimpse of the current world, presenting an additional terrifying dilemma for Ethan, because the entity would soon take control of the nuclear weapons of various countries. Feeling disgusted with the available choices, Ethan stepped out of the box and didn't care about the options given by the entity, because at that moment, Ethan chose to save Luther and run as fast as possible. And it turns out the vision he got from the entity was true, because right now Luther is in danger. Apparently, what Luther is currently working on is creating a deadly virus to counter the entity's intelligence. They named the virus the poison pill, which is believed to be able to incapacitate the entity if the virus is inserted into the entity's program. And Luther is the only person who can create this virus. Knowing this fact, Gabriel locked Luther in his care cell and secured it with a nuclear bomb that could destroy the entire city of London, and stole the poison pill so that no one else could create the virus, because Gabriel wanted to control the entity. At this moment, it became the most emotional moment for Ethan, because Luther knew very well that there was only one choice, that he had to die to save the entire city. Even if Luther managed to cut the detonator, the bomb explosion would only destroy the tunnel. Luther then said that if Gabriel had taken the poison pill, Ethan should go to him. Luther also asked Ethan not to give up on finding Gabriel and neutralizing the entity. And with a heavy heart, Ethan let his friend go. However, when Ethan exited the tunnel, Briggs and his troops were already waiting outside. However, it is not only the entity that can foresee the possibilities of the future. Ethan had already calculated several steps ahead and knew about the arrival of Briggs and his troops. Even though Ethan knows the fact that Briggs is the son of Jimples, the IMF director he killed in his first Mission Impossible sequel, and one thing that the entity overlooked based on its calculations, Ethan would be finished at the hands of Briggs to avenge his father's death. However, human feelings cannot be calculated so easily, because Briggs actually preferred to drag Ethan before the president. In front of Ethan now stands Erica Ceylon, the president, along with her advisors and military high-ranking officials by her side. The president also wanted to hear what Ethan's desires were. Hearing Ethan request military facility support to reach Sevastopol, the high-ranking officials immediately opposed him and laughed at him. Remembering that Ethan had previously committed acts of defiance, Ethan denied that all his acts of defiance had always yielded results. Ethan insisted on convincing the president that currently only the United States, the United Kingdom, China, and Russia can still control their nuclear weapons. It's only a matter of time before the entity takes over all nuclear rockets worldwide. However, the military dismissed it, considering the entity to be just an artificial intelligence, until Ethan's words were proven true, as the British confirmed that they had just lost the security of their nuclear arsenal. Even knowing this, President Erica still detained Ethan and said that within 72 hours, she would launch missiles towards the countries that had been taken over by the entity, before those countries aimed their missiles at America, blaming Ethan as the cause. At that moment, Ethan was being escorted to his cell, but unexpectedly, the Marines outside released him, because it turns out that the president secretly gave Ethan a chance and tasked him with eliminating the entity. Meanwhile, the Marine who removed his handcuffs at that moment gave a hopeful look to the man in front of him, believing that the future of the world was in that man's hands. Ethan and his companions arrived in the Pacific Ocean region, armed with a letter from the president, and met Admiral Nelly on an aircraft carrier. They estimate that the Sevastopol ship is at the bottom of the sea, which has been covered in ice, specifically in the Bering Sea area around San Matthew Island in Russia. Ethan's team's plan is beyond reason, because what Benji explained to the others is, Ethan will enter the very cold Sevastopol with only a simple decompression chamber to save him. The device is used to prevent the hypothermia that Ethan will later experience, which will leave him in a near-death condition, and then Benji plans to revive him. It sounds impossible, but this is Mission Impossible. Meanwhile, the others will head to San Matthew Island to obtain the exact coordinates of the Sevastopol ship's location. Benji and his crew arrived at San Matthew Island. Their goal was to read the SOSUS data recordings or sound surveillance system. Beneath the world's oceans, there is a network of acoustic cables that has existed since the Cold War, where SOSUS stations will record various underwater events, including the sinking of the Sevastopol ship. With the SOSUS data recordings, they were able to determine the coordinates of the Sevastopol submarine's location, and unexpectedly, the person now holding the SOSUS data in San Matthew is Benji's old friend. The man in question is named William Don Liu, a former CIA analyst who was fired because of Ethan's actions in the first sequel. William confirmed that he knew the coordinates of the Sevastopol ship, but unexpectedly, the Russian military had already arrived with the same intent and purpose. The problem didn't only occur with Benji and his friends, but also with Ethan, who is currently flying towards the Bering Sea, where they were attacked by Russian forces. Not wanting to sacrifice the crew, Ethan jumped into the open sea. But unfortunately, one military faction still managed to capture him. Fortunately, the ones who managed to capture Ethan were the crew of the American submarine under the command of Captain Balesto. Then Ethan provided proof that he was sent by Admiral Nelly, who requested assistance to take Ethan to a certain location. The Bering Sea itself has a quite vast coverage area, but Ethan focused more on the waters around San Matthew Island, which at that time were guarded by a Russian submarine named Losharik, part of the aircraft carrier Belgorod. The submarine, manned by the most lethal Russian diving forces. But Balesto said Ethan need not worry, because Ethan had asked for help from the right person. At the residence of William Don Liu, there was a moment of tension, because Don Liu had previously possessed recordings of the sinking of the Sevastopolo. But those recordings were destroyed immediately after the ship sank, suggesting that someone was trying to cover it up. Grace also tried to convince the Russian side that they were not on anyone's side and were only trying to stop the entity's might. But all of Grace's efforts ended in vain. However, unexpectedly, William Don Liu secretly memorized the coordinates, and Don Liu realized that Team Benji was the right team to give the coordinates to, instead of the Russian side. Don Liu secretly noted it down and wrote it on a piece of paper, then handed it to his wife. Grace accompanied Don Liu's wife, who pretended to take care of their pets, where Grace exchanged codes with Don Liu's wife. However, their efforts ended up causing a bit of commotion. In another place, Ethan is currently preparing for his dive, but unfortunately, one of Balesto's troops has been misled by false news from the entity, where he intends to kill Ethan. In two different places, they put up a fight as best as they could, and although both were momentarily overwhelmed, in the end, they managed to regain control of the situation. Not long after, Ethan obtained the coordinates and immediately headed to the location. However, the problem is that their movements will be monitored by the Russians, so Ethan ordered Captain Balesto to leave immediately after dropping Ethan at the coordinates. Captain Balesto tried to stop him, because without a decompression chamber in his submarine, Ethan would surely freeze to death out there. However, Ethan, not wanting to endanger the crew of the Balesto any further, chose the decompression chamber that Benji had brought. Then the diving process began, at an unknown depth, but in the end, Ethan successfully reached the Sevastopol submarine. Inside, Ethan searched for the server where the entity's source code was stored, but he was shocked to find the crew's bodies intact. Even more horrifying was that the server's location was blocked by a pile of missiles that could explode at any moment. Ethan's journey became more difficult because Ethan's arrival triggered a pressure change inside the ship. Fortunately, the movement did not trigger a missile explosion. Finally, Ethan found where he had to use the cross key he had been keeping, and Ethan also managed to obtain the entity's source code. When Ethan tried to exit the submarine, unfortunately, a missile blocked his exit door, forcing Ethan to look for another way out, which he suspected might be a missile launcher. Because it was too cramped, Ethan was forced to temporarily remove his diving gear, and at the same time, the ship was about to sink even deeper. After managing to get out, the problems didn't stop there, because Ethan's diving suit got caught on part of the ship, leaving him without diving equipment. And here is the climax. In a super cold temperature without diving gear, and the distance from the sea surface beyond his reach, Ethan nearly died from hypothermia. However, Grace came to save Ethan from death by bringing him to decompression to rescue him. Soon after, while on the plane, Ethan apologized to Don Liu for the incident 30 years ago. However, Don Liu does not regret anything at all, because if he hadn't been fired from the CIA, he might not have found his happiness by now. Meanwhile, Entity has currently taken control of nuclear missiles from around the world, and only America has been able to maintain the security of its missiles so far. And there is one reason why Entity has not launched its missiles until now, because it turns out Entity itself has not found a safe place to hide. Ethan himself knows exactly where the Entity is targeting, because when Ethan communicated with the Entity briefly showed him. The place in question is a server location in Kongoyoa, South Africa, a server with a capacity of 1 billion GB, rumored to store the knowledge of all humanity. There are no transmission in and out routes at that location, solar-powered, storm-resistant, and so on. So if the Entity reaches that place, it becomes even more untouchable. They plan to combine the Entity's source code with the poison pill that Luther has created. However, the problem is that the poison pills are now in Gabriel's hands. And not only the poison pills that Luther made, he also managed to create a large capacity storage that will later be used to contain the Entity. However, the problem doesn't stop there, because after the Entity is successfully stored in the flash drive, that will automatically activate the launch of Entity's missiles, and they must be on time to remove the flash drive, because if they are late, Entity will have already launched its missiles, and if they remove the flash drive too quickly, the Entity will detach from the flash drive and resume its threats. Then this matter will be handed over to Grace's swift hands, as that is her expertise. In America, President Erica is currently under pressure from her subordinates to launch the nuclear rocket first before the Entity does. But the president prefers to trust Ethan. Now Ethan and his companions have arrived in Africa, where their arrival has been awaited by Gabriel and his troops, complete with a high-yield bomb. Benji and Grace were also heading to the server location, while Paris, Don Liu, and his wife were on guard outside. At that moment, Ethan was making small talk in front of Gabriel, but when Ethan was about to hand over the source code, Briggs and his team arrived at the same place, accompanied by Kitri, the former IMF director from the previous Mission Impossible. Meanwhile, in the midst of the countdown to a bomb that will explode in 20 minutes, Kitri casually claims ownership of the Entity, even though it's clear she knows nothing about it. Gabriel's mercenary troops didn't just stand by, which eventually led to a shootout. This chaos made Gabriel take the next step by escaping with the poison pill with him. Of course, Ethan had no other choice but to go after Gabriel alone, bringing his source code with him. However, it wasn't easy at all, because Gabriel's henchmen came to obstruct him. As much as possible, Ethan chased Gabriel, who escaped with his plane, and clearly, that made it impossible for Ethan to catch him. Ethan briefly thought about giving up, but Gabriel's men arrived with another plane, allowing Ethan to hang underneath it. Ethan managed to hold on and successfully took over the plane. Meanwhile, at the server location, a new problem arises because Benji is the only one who understands how the server works, but he has suffered severe gunshot wounds, where he is experiencing a pneumothorax that will suffocate him due to his collapsed lung. So, he asked Grace to handle the server according to his instructions, which was truly absurd because the incident coincided with an impromptu operation performed by Paris, who had no medical experience whatsoever. Armed only with instructions from Benji, Paris did his best to expel the trapped air from his lungs, and in the midst of the operation, Benji instructed Grace to wait for the red indicator light to turn green as a sign that Ethan had successfully installed the poison pill into the Entity's source code. If Ethan succeeds, Grace must cut the red wire to sever the Entity's connection, and in the blink of an eye, Grace must immediately remove her flash drive to trap the Entity inside it. Meanwhile, in America, President Erica is starting to face pressure from her defense minister to immediately launch the nuclear missile. However, unexpectedly, one of the agents was deceived by the Entity's trickery, where the minister sacrificed himself. And at that moment, America's nuclear arsenal was now under the control of the Entity, so America's hope was in the hands of Ethan and his team. Meanwhile, out there, Don Liu is currently disarming his bomb, and unexpectedly, Don finds a way to neutralize its explosion. Elsewhere, a chase ensues between Ethan and Gabriel, with Ethan bravely hiding right under Gabriel's plane. Ethan managed to defeat Gabriel and made him fall, because the plane lost control. Then Ethan jumped with a burning parachute, while installing a poison pill into its source code. At that moment, the entity's indicator light turned green, and it took just the right timing for Grace to cut the red wire and remove the flash drive. Then, the electricity around the world suddenly went out, and the flash drive in Grace's hand lit up, leaving Grace confused about whether he had made a mistake. Sometime later, the electricity came back on as a sign that their efforts had paid off, and finally, Benji could pass out peacefully. Ethan also managed to land with his backup parachute, and at that moment, Luther's voice was heard from the poison pill he had made. From that message, Luther expressed his gratitude, because if Ethan managed to hear his voice, it meant Ethan had succeeded in saving the world. He also sent a message to Ethan to always be on the side of righteousness, as if the fate of the world depended on him, just like now. At that moment, Kitri arrived in front of Ethan, who was still asking about the entity, but Kitri was easily deceived and had to leave empty-handed. Meanwhile, Briggs is grateful because there are still people like Ethan, who are willing to hide from the pursuit of various parties, including his own country, all to protect human safety. Ethan and his team met in an area of Trafalgar Square, where Grace preferred to hand over the entity to Ethan, rather than the IMF, which currently sheltered it. And at the end of the story, Ethan played Luther's voicemail again, a final message from Luther reminding not to forget to subscribe Spoiler Saga. See you in the next content.